In the heart of the vast, sun-scorched savanna, where the heat shimmers in visible waves above the cracked earth and the acacia thorns cast skeletal shadows, a tiny life teeters on the brink of oblivion. It is a lion cub, no bigger than a full-grown hare, its spotted coat dusty, and its ribs showing faintly beneath the sparse fur. The great Ndova pride, a tawny river of muscle and might, flows onward, driven by the ancient imperatives of hunger and survival in a season that offers little clemency. They do not look back. They cannot. The unpitying law of the wild dictates that the weak are left behind, a harsh truth that ensures the strength of the collective. The cub, a small, forgotten punctuation mark at the end of a long, determined sentence, stumbles, its cries thin and reedy, swallowed by the immense silence of the plains. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you believe kindness exists in the wild, hit that like button and subscribe. The little one is alone, a morsel of vulnerability in a world of giants and hunters. The sin of its distress, faint as it is, will soon be a beacon for other, less discriminating predators. The grass, brittle and yellow, offers scant cover. Overhead, the sky is a merciless, pale blue, empty save for a distant speck that might be a vulture, already beginning its patient vigil. The cub's mother, her own belly lean, had nuzzled it once, a brief, mournful touch, before the alpha male's guttural summons pulled her, and the rest of the pride, towards the distant promise of water and game. For her to linger would be to endanger her other, stronger offspring, and perhaps herself. Such is the brutal arithmetic of life on the savanna. The cub collapses, a tiny heap of despair in the endless landscape, the rhythmic thud of the pride's departing paws fading into the whisper of the dry wind. But something is about to shift in that silence, an aberration in the ancient script of survival. The old lion, known to the wind and the sparse trees as Ascari, had been trailing at the pride's periphery for many seasons. His mane, once a glorious corona of black and gold, was now streaked with gray, thinner in places, bearing the maps of countless battles in its ragged edges and the pale lines of scars that crisscrossed his noble, weary face. His massive shoulders, though still powerful, moved with a certain stiffness, a testament to a long life lived at the sharp end of existence. He was no longer a challenger for dominance, nor a primary hunter. His role was that of a seasoned elder, a silent repository of pride history, tolerated for his past glories and the lingering respect he commanded, but largely left to his own devices. He had seen countless cubs born, seen many perish, understood the grim calculus of the pride's survival. He had fathered champions and watched them fall. He had felt the sun bake his hide through droughts worse than this, and tasted the rain when it finally broke. As the pride crested a low rise and began to disappear into the shimmering heat haze, Ascari had paused. His amber eyes, though perhaps not as sharp as they once were, had missed nothing. He had seen the small cub falter, had heard its weakening cries, had noted the finality with which the mother had turned away. He stood, a statue of ochre and shadow against the parched land, long after the last tail tuft of the pride vanished. The wind carried the scent of dust, dry grass, and the faintest, almost imperceptible aroma of utter helplessness emanating from the spot where the cub lay. A low rumble vibrated deep in Ascari's chest, a sound that was neither growl nor purr, but something ancient and resonant. The primary antagonist in this unfolding drama was not a rival male or a pack of snarling hyenas, not yet anyway. It was the savanna itself, in its current unforgiving mood. The dry season had stretched on, relentless and cruel. Waterholes had shrunk to muddy pits, then to cracked earth. The great herds of wildebeest and zebra, the pride's lifeblood, had moved on, following the distant promise of rain, forcing the lions to travel further, expend more energy, and take greater risks for every kill. For a cub so young and frail, the equation was simple. To be left behind was to be sentenced to death, whether by thirst, starvation, or the quick, brutal efficiency of a scavenger. High above, the lone speck resolved itself into the unmistakable silhouette of a lappet-faced vulture, its massive wingspan effortlessly riding the thermals. Its presence was a subtle, ominous note, a quiet underscoring of the cub's perilous situation. The air was thick with the scent of heated earth and the distant, almost subliminal smell of unseen dangers. The vast grasslands stretched in every direction, an ocean of pale gold under an immense sky, beautiful in its starkness, yet utterly indifferent to the small life struggling within it. Ascari knew this land. He knew its moods, its deceptions, its hidden perils, and its rare, precious sanctuaries. He also knew the pride would not, could not, return. The cub's desperate, intermittent peeps were a clear signal of its distress, a fragile thread of sound in the overwhelming silence, and it was a sound that seemed to snag at something deep within the old warrior. The definitive moment of abandonment arrived not with a roar or a charge, but with the slow, agonizing realization that the pride was truly gone. The last echoes of their passage had dissolved into the omnipresent hum of the African bush. The cub, after a final, futile attempt to stagger forward, had simply crumpled, its tiny body a study in exhaustion and surrender. It lay panting, its sides heaving, small despairing whimpers escaping its dry throat. This was it. The bond, stretched thin by miles and necessity, had finally snapped. It was then that Askari moved. Not forward, in the direction the pride had taken, but slowly, deliberately, he turned. His massive head, with its weary, knowing eyes, swiveled back towards the place where the cub lay. Each step was measured, heavy, yet imbued with a strange, quiet purpose that belied his age and the usual lethargy of a sated, or simply old, lion. This was the unexpected compassion, an act that defied the harsh logic of his world. He was choosing to walk back towards a life that, by all accounts, was already forfeit. The cub, sensing or perhaps smelling the approach of a large predator, reacted with the only defense it knew. A pathetic, tinny hiss, more air than sound, escaped it. It tried to shrink further into the dust, to make itself invisible, its tiny heart hammering against its ribs. It could not know the intent of this giant, only that it was alone and vulnerable. Askari stopped a respectful distance away, lowering his great head, his ears swiveling, assessing. He made no aggressive sound, no sudden movement. He simply stood, watching, a colossal figure of patient observation. He blinked slowly, a sign in the feline world that could, in some contexts, signal non-aggression. The sun beat down, relentless, and the shadow of the vulture overhead seemed to grow a fraction larger. Askari's first, gentle nudge with his broad muzzle was met with another weak hiss, a tiny paw flailing uselessly. The old lion merely rumbled, a soft, continuous vibration, as if trying to soothe the terrified infant with the sheer depth of his presence. He understood its fear. He also understood its desperate need. The afternoon sun climbed to its zenith, leaching moisture from everything it touched. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the savanna, and the cub, already dehydrated, began to suffer more acutely. Its panting became shallower, its movements almost non-existent. Askari, after his initial, cautious approach, lay down nearby, a tawny mountain range offering a sliver of shade. He watched the cub with an unwavering gaze, occasionally testing the air with his black nose, alert to any change in scent, any new sound that might signal approaching danger. He rose, ponderous and slow, and with infinite gentleness, nudged the cub again, this time more insistently, trying to guide it towards the meager shade offered by his own body. The cub, too weak to resist, too exhausted to protest further, allowed itself to be moved a few inches, collapsing again almost immediately. Askari lay down once more, positioning himself to shield the tiny creature from the worst of the sun's glare. His own thirst was a familiar ache, his hunger a dull emptiness, but these sensations were old companions. The cub's distress was something new, something that tugged at an ancient, almost forgotten instinct. From far across the plains, carried on the shimmering air, came the distinctive, giggling whoop of a spotted hyena. Then another, closer. Askari's head came up, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, pinpointing the direction of the sound. His eyes, though old, glinted with a spark of their former fire. He knew the hyenas would be drawn to any sign of weakness, any straggler. A lone old lion and a dying cub would be a tempting prospect. He tried again to encourage the cub to move, nudging it towards a slightly more sheltered depression beneath a stunted, thorny bush a few yards away. The cub managed a few trembling steps, then stumbled, its legs too weak to support even its meager weight. Askari let out a low groan, a sound of profound frustration, or perhaps empathy. He then did something remarkable. He lowered his massive head, and with the utmost care, tried to grip the scruff of the cub's neck in his jaws, the way a lioness would carry her young. But his jaws were built for crushing bone, for delivering fatal bites to prey many times this cub's size. It was an awkward, clumsy attempt. The cub cried out, a thin, sharp sound of pain and fear. Askari released it instantly, a look of something akin to dismay in his eyes. He could not carry it that way. He lay beside it, panting lightly, the effort and the heat taking their toll. He scanned the horizon, his gaze lingering on the distant, dancing heat devils. He was old. This exertion, this constant vigilance, was costly. He could leave. He could walk away, find a shady spot, conserve his energy, perhaps even try to track the pride, but the chances of him catching up now were slim. Yet, he stayed. The sounds of the hyenas grew subtly louder, closer. They were testing, probing, their voices laced with a greedy confidence. Suddenly, two jackals, emboldened by the old lion's apparent preoccupation and the overwhelming scent of vulnerability from the cub, darted into view. They were sleek, opportunistic, their intelligent eyes fixed on the small, motionless form beside Ascari. They danced at the edge of a safe distance, yipping, feinting, testing the old lion's defenses. This was a direct challenge. Ascari rose, not with the explosive speed of his youth, but with a deliberate, immense power that was still formidable. A deep, rumbling growl started in his chest, a sound that seemed to shake the very air around him. He took a step towards the jackals, then another. The growl escalated into a short, sharp roar, a sound that still carried the authority of a king, albeit an aging one. He lunged, a surprisingly agile movement for his size and age, scattering the jackals like dried leaves in a gust of wind. They yelped and fled, disappearing into the tall grass, but Ascari knew they, or others like them, would be back. The effort cost him. He was breathing more heavily now, his sides heaving. He returned to the cub, which had watched the exchange with wide, terrified eyes. It lay utterly still, its breathing shallow, almost imperceptible. For a dreadful moment, Ascari must have wondered if it was too late, if the tiny spark of life had finally been extinguished. He lowered his head, sniffing at the cub, then nudged it very gently. A faint twitch of an ear, a minuscule sigh. Still alive. But the margin was impossibly thin. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and bruised purple, the hyena calls became more distinct, more brazen. Ascari managed to nudge and coax the cub a few more feet, into the slightly deeper shade of a dense acacia shrub, its thorns a partial deterrent. Here, at least, they were less exposed. The true turning point was not a dramatic rescue by an external force, but a profound internal shift within Ascari, a cementing of his extraordinary, unspoken commitment. As the coolness of evening began to settle over the savanna, bringing with it a temporary reprieve from the oppressive heat, the cub stirred. It was still desperately weak, but some tiny reserve of strength had returned. It looked at the massive, scarred face of the old lion lying patiently beside it, and for the first time, there was something other than terror in its gaze. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the dawning awareness that this colossal creature was not, in fact, a threat, but a shield. It let out the faintest of sounds, a tiny, mewling sigh, and instinctively, perhaps, leaned its small head almost imperceptibly against Ascari's foreleg. The old lion went still, his breathing momentarily suspended. Then, very slowly, he lowered his great head and gave the cub's dusty fur a single, rough lick with his raspy tongue. It was a gesture of acceptance, of reassurance, a primal acknowledgement of a bond forged in the crucible of shared peril. Night was fast approaching, and with it came a new set of dangers. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the nocturnal savanna began to fill the void left by the dying day, the chirping of crickets, the distant cough of a leopard, the ever-present, unsettling calls of the hyenas, now sounding closer, more confident. The cub needed more than just shade and protection. It desperately needed sustenance, warmth, and a truly secure refuge for the long, dark hours ahead. Ascari knew he couldn't hunt effectively while guarding the cub. Even if he made a kill, he couldn't leave the cub alone to feed, nor could he easily bring food back. His options were narrowing. He rose, pacing a small circle around the acacia shrub, his mind, honed by decades of survival, assessing the grim realities. He could try to defend this spot, but it was not ideal. A determined pack of hyenas could eventually overwhelm him, especially if he was also trying to protect the cub. He looked down at the small, fragile creature, then made his decision. He would have to move it, carry it. The earlier attempt to scruff it had failed, but perhaps now, with the cub slightly less terrified, and with a different approach. He nudged it again, gently, trying to encourage it onto its feet. The cub wobbled, but remained standing for a moment. Then, with infinite care, Ascari opened his massive jaws, not wide in a threat, but just enough. He maneuvered his head, nudging the cub's flank, trying to get it to understand, to cooperate. Finally, he managed to gently scoop the cub up, not by the scruff, but by carefully engulfing its small torso in his mouth, his immense canines held wide, his grip incredibly delicate. The cub went limp, perhaps in terror, perhaps in resignation. It was a shocking sight, the tiny, spotted body almost disappearing into the fearsome maw of the old lion, yet held with a tenderness that was breathtaking. This act, this decision to carry the cub, was Ascari's true commitment, a silent vow made against the harsh laws of his world. The journey began under a sky dusted with the first stars, the landscape bathed in the ethereal silver of the rising moon. Long, distorted shadows danced and swayed as Ascari moved, each step a careful, ponderous placement of his massive paws. The cub was a feather-light burden in terms of weight, but the awkwardness of carrying it, the need for such extreme gentleness, made the trek arduous for the old lion. His breath came in steady, deep sighs, misting in the cooling air. The sounds of the night were a constant symphony of potential threats. Every rustle in the grass, every distant snap of a twig, caused Ascari's ears to swivel, his pace to falter momentarily as he scanned the darkness. They had not traveled far when the hyenas, drawn by an irresistible combination of scents, the vulnerable cub, the lone old lion, the lingering aroma of their day-long vigil, made their appearance. 3 of them at first, then 5, materializing from the shadows like grotesque phantoms. Their eerie whoops and cackles echoed through the night, bold and challenging. Ascari stopped. He couldn't run, not while carrying the cub. He couldn't fight effectively either. Very gently, he lowered the cub to the ground, placing it behind his legs, and turned to face the pack, his body a formidable shield. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his chest, a warning that still carried the echoes of his prime. His lips curled back, exposing teeth that, though worn, were still capable of inflicting terrible damage. The hyenas fanned out, their customary tactic, trying to unnerve him, to find an opening. One particularly bold individual, larger than the others, with a scarred muzzle, lunged forward, snapping its powerful jaws. Ascari met the feint with a short, explosive roar and a lunge of his own, his massive paw swiping through the air with surprising speed. It didn't connect, but the sheer force of it made the hyena yelp and stumble back. For several long, tense minutes, it was a standoff. The hyenas darted in and out, testing, probing, their calls incessant. Ascari stood his ground, a bastion of defiance, turning slowly to keep them all in view, the cub pressed trembling against his hind legs. He knew he couldn't keep this up all night. His energy was finite. He was old, and they were many and patient. He needed a more defensible position. During a brief lull, as the hyenas regrouped, he quickly, gently, scooped up the cub again and resumed his slow, deliberate march, scanning the moonlit landscape for any feature that might offer an advantage. His stamina was visibly waning. His breaths were harsher, his movements slower. One hyena, bolder than the rest, darted in from the side, aiming for his flank. Ascari twisted, the cub still held securely, and managed to land a glancing blow with his shoulder, sending the hyena tumbling, but not before its teeth grazed his leg, drawing a thin line of blood. He ignored the sting, pressing on. Finally, he saw it, a small jumble of rocks, a miniature copy, offering a slightly elevated position with a solid back, limiting the angles of attack. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than the open plain. With a final surge of effort, he reached the rocks, carefully depositing the cub in a shallow crevice, then turned to face his pursuers, his back to the stone. Here, they could not surround him. They would have to come at him from the front. The hyenas, frustrated and wary of the old lion's determined defense in this more advantageous position, circled for a while longer, their calls now tinged with annoyance rather than confidence. Ascari met their every feint with a steadfast glare and a deep, threatening growl. He was a portrait of exhaustion and indomitable will, his scarred body a testament to a life of struggle, his spirit, in this moment, burning with a fierce, protective fire. One of the hyenas, perhaps sensing the futility or the unacceptable risk of a direct assault against such a determined adversary in a defensible spot, let out a final, frustrated yelp and began to slink away. Slowly, one by one, the others followed, their forms melting back into the darkness from which they had emerged. The immediate, acute danger had passed. Ascari stood listening until their calls faded into the distance. Then, with a deep, shuddering sigh, he sank to the ground beside the crevice, his massive body forming a warm, living barricade in front of the cub. The tiny creature, nestled against his comforting bulk and the surprising warmth of his fur, finally relaxed, its terror slowly giving way to an exhausted sleep. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in soft strokes of rose and gold. The air was crisp and clean, washed by the night. Ascari was already awake, his old bones stiff, the scratch on his leg a dull ache, but his amber eyes were clear, alert, scanning the vast panorama of the awakening savanna. He turned his great head slowly and looked down at the cub. It was still alive. It stirred, blinked its large, dark eyes, and for the first time, looked directly at Ascari not with fear, but with a dawning, innocent curiosity. It emitted a tiny, almost inaudible sound, a weak, hesitant purr that vibrated against Ascari's fur. Then, with an instinct as old as time, it nudged its small head against his massive chest. Ascari responded with a gentle rumble, a soft exhalation of breath, and then, very slowly, he began to lick the cub's head, his rough tongue surprisingly tender, cleaning away the dust and grime of its ordeal. The old lion knew this was not an end, but a new, extraordinarily difficult beginning. His life, which had been winding down into a quiet twilight, was now inextricably linked to this tiny, fragile being. He would have to hunt for two, a monumental task for a lion of his age and diminished strength. He would have to protect it constantly, guide it, teach it, if it was to have any chance at all. The savanna remained an unforgiving place. Yet, as the cub, feeling the warmth and the reassuring presence of its unlikely guardian, made a tiny, playful swat at a loose strand of Ascari's mane with a miniature, unsheathed paw, a profound shift had occurred. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant against the backdrop of their struggle, but it was a sign, a spark of life rekindled, a fragile trust bestowed. Later, Ascari found a patch of dew-laden grass, and he patiently nudged the cub towards it, watching as it licked at the precious moisture. It was still incredibly weak, its survival a day-to-day, hour-to-hour proposition, but the spark of life that had been so close to extinguishing now burned with a tiny, resilient flame. There was hope, fragile but present. As the sun climbed higher, casting its golden light across the plains, Ascari rose. He looked out over the familiar landscape, his expression unreadable. The pride was gone, his old life with them. Now, there was only this, a vast, indifferent wilderness and a tiny, dependent cub. He and the cub were a new pride, an unlikely alliance of the old and the very young, the powerful and the utterly vulnerable. He took a slow, deliberate step, and the cub, after a moment's hesitation, wobbled after him. The vast savanna stretched before them, immense and uncaring, yet in the heart of that ancient indifference, a fierce, improbable tenderness had taken root, a bond forged in dust and desperation, under the silent, watchful gaze of the African sky. Thanks for watching. If this story touched you, give it a like and subscribe for more wild moments of wonder.